First name is Janella, Junella. Last name is Wadden, UAD as in Delta, AN.
May it please the court?
May proceed, sir.
Where do you work, ma'am?
I'm currently employed with the Orange County Sheriff's Office here in Orlando, Florida.
And what does Sheriff Mina currently having you do?
I'm currently, my current position is a digital forensic examiner.
And how long have you held that position?
I just hit 6 years. Yes, for this specific phone, we were trying to minimally get the user data, again, the stuff that you guys can see when you're looking through your phone, your calls, your messages, your pictures, your videos. And in this case, that's the level of support that the on-scene software that we're able to use is able to download from the phone, especially with having a password or passcode. Yes, in this case, we use, again, a more advanced tool, which is able to capture, the technical term is a full file system. So we're capturing that whole filing cabinet, you would say, of the data stored on the phone, with, again, the probability to not only collect possibly deleted data, but also your systems information, application data, like your social media, messaging apps, everything aside from your normal user data, like your calls and messages and pictures and videos. Yes, so Apple is very good about recording activity on the directly from your device. When you open up a certain application, such as the camera, Apple is making note that you, in this case, it's indicating a start time. So you opened up your camera at 10:21:36 p.m. And then you stopped using it, maybe closed it out or stopped recording at 10:21:38 p.m.
Turning down to 17167. It's an instant message that indicates it's outgoing from this device on January 13th, 2020, 5:01 p.m., 41 seconds. And it's from what is paren owner. Does that mean it's from the device?
Yes.
What's the content of that text message?
Sorry, what was the line item number?
17167.
And bless you and all of you too, I'll get rid of him.
Then the next three are also outgoing messages. What do they indicate as far as content?
Starting with 17168, then I'll be better, followed by 17169, ugh, and 17170, Torres.
For everything you've done to me. For everything you've done to me. Fuck you. Fuck you. Stupid. That's my name. Don't wear it out.
I can't fucking breathe, babe. Seriously.
Yeah, that's when you do when you choke me.
Sarah. Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
That's on you.
Sarah, I can't breathe.
It's on you.
Sarah.
Real or ransom. Might want to give it for it extra. Cause I got this.
Sarah.
Real or ransom.
Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
Oh. That's what I feel like when you jingle me.
Sarah.
Fuck you.
Fucking breathe, Sarah.
Yeah. You should probably shut the fuck up.
Oh,
All right, on the examples that you gave us, who was the identifying name as to the outgoing on this phone?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Who was the identifying name for the outgoing texts or calls on this phone?
I think in some of the line items that were shown above, it was just listed as a phone number.
Was there ever a name listed?
A physical name, possibly in other line items, but in this, and again, in those excerpts, it's just by phone number.
Okay. Did you ever see the name Brian Boone?
Yes,
It's not telling you the person who sent the message, is it?
correct, just that it's originating from a phone number.
So if two people or more people had access to a phone, you wouldn't, from this information, you wouldn't be able to tell who actually sent the message on any given time. Is that correct?
No, I'm not a fly on the wall and I can't see who's physically typing out messages.
Thank you, ma'am. No further questions.
State and spell your name for the record for us.
Sarah Zadovich, Saryzydowicz.
Thank you. You may inquire.
Good morning, ma'am.
Morning.
Can you tell us, what do you do for a living?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
And who do you work for?
I work for Orange County. We cover Orange County and Osceola County.
And how long have you been a forensic pathologist?
I've been at this office for about 12 years and then 1 year in Tampa, so about 13 years.
No other questions of this witness?
Any cross-examination?
In your career, approximately how many autopsies have you performed?
Around 3,000.
And have you previously testified as an expert witness in court?
Yes.
Turning our attention to this case, did you perform the autopsy?
Yes.
And what were your findings as to cause and manner of death?
So the cause of death, which I put on the death certificate, is positional asphyxia with environmental suffocation. And the manner of death I classified as homicide.
In this case, what information were you provided ahead of time?
So the information that I had was that the decedent was with his girlfriend, and at some point in time in the night, he got into a suitcase, which was then zippered shut. At another point at time, I believe she went to bed, and then the next morning discovered that he was still in the suitcase. And I think that was in about an 11-hour time frame from the information that I had.
You mentioned asphyxia. Can you explain for us what asphyxia is?
Sure. So asphyxia is a very general term. It would be kind of like saying, I drive a car, right? That's very generic, and we know that there are many different types of cars out there, right? So asphyxia simply means lack of oxygen or inadequate oxygen for an individual. And there are different categories of asphyxia. So you can have suffocation, which just means that there's obstruction of the airways. So that could be smothering, that could be somebody choking on a piece of food, or maybe just being in an environment where there's not enough oxygen in the air to sustain that individual. There's a category called strangulation. That would be compression of the neck, either blood vessels or airways. There's another category called mechanical asphyxia. That can be when the body is in an unusual or abnormal position where the actual mechanics of breathing can't occur. So that can be the position of the body, or it can be, like, let's say if a heavy object fell on somebody and you simply can't breathe because of the weight of that object. That would be a mechanical asphyxia. And then there's drowning. That's a different type of asphyxia. And there are a couple of other categories as well that are much less common.
You also mentioned environmental suffocation. Could you tell us a little bit more what that means in more layman's terms?
So that just means that there's not enough oxygen in the environment that the person is in. You could think of somebody who's in an enclosed space where there's a fixed amount of oxygen. So as that oxygen is, as that person is breathing, they're using up all the oxygen. And once it's gone, there's no oxygen left. Or you could think of maybe people who are, climbing Mount Everest. There's not as much oxygen up there, and that's why they have oxygen tanks. So it just means that the amount of oxygen available in the air around that person is not enough to sustain them.
In this case, what can you tell us about how long George Torres was in that suitcase?
There's not a really good way for me to give you a time frame as to how long he was in that suitcase. Again, because there was both the component of positional asphyxia, being in an unusual position for a period of time, and then also the environmental suffocation component. Because within that suitcase, certainly there's going to be oxygen, but it's not going to be the same as if you were sitting in a room like this. And because there are those multiple components happening at the same time, there's not a really good way to estimate or say with scientific certainty, oh, he was in for X amount of time. There's really not a good way to do that.
What position were you able to determine he was in that suitcase?
I wasn't able to see what position he was in. By the time that our medical legal death investigators were at the scene, he was already removed from the suitcase. Based on some of the findings, I favor that he was most likely in like a fetal type position. So knees flexed, arms flexed, and the head most likely flexed forward. But again, that's from my findings. I didn't see what position he was in.
What side of his body would he be resting on in this fetal position?
That's that most likely his left side. However, I do say the caveat that some of the findings are dependent on time, meaning that, if that suitcase had been moved or flipped over, that could be different than what I'm seeing at the time of my examination.
Additionally, did you note any injuries to the body of George Torres?
Yes.
These injuries that you noted to the body of George Torres, did you document them on what's called a body chart?
Yes, the diagram on a body chart, and we also take pictures as I'm going through my examination.
So, ma'am, on this body chart, can you describe for us and point out what was the first blunt impact injury that you identified?
So there were some blunt impact injuries to his head. I don't think it's on this one, but there were some blunt impact injuries to his head right up here around the eye and on the mouth area.
And then, did you notate any injuries to his hand?
Yes, so there were some ecchymoses, or you can think of that as like a large kind of bruise on both hands.
What other blunt impact injuries did you identify?
So there was a series of ecchymoses on the left side of the back, which right about here.
And any others?
There were some on the forearms as well.
And you use this body chart, you say, in addition to photographing the injuries that you document, correct?
Yes.
And I believe it's on the body chart itself. Do you document the height and weight of the person as well?
Yes.
And what was the height of Mr. Torres in this
So,
case?
yeah, so technically for us, it's length. Height is the measurement that's taken while someone is standing. So his length was 62 inches, and his weight was 103 pounds.
In regards to these blunt impact injuries, how is it that you come to the conclusion that these injuries were the result of blunt impacts?
So these are typical wounding patterns for blunt force trauma. And when I say blunt force trauma, that can mean something striking a part of the body, Or, on the other hand, it can be the body striking an object. And that causes injury to the skin, and to the soft tissue, and sometimes the deeper tissues, depending on how severe or how strong that blunt force trauma is.
Are these injuries consistent with a person being struck with a baseball bat?
They could be, yes.
Are they consistent with a person being pushed down a flight of stairs?
They could be, yes.
As part of your examination, do you also check the toxicology of George Torres?
Yes.
And is that something that's pretty standard in any autopsy?
Yes.
And what were the toxicology results for George Torres?
So there was a blood alcohol level of 0.139 milligrams per deciliter, and there was also caffeine and nicotine detected as well.
You also stated earlier that you document your autopsy findings also photographically, correct?
Yes.
And this is George Torres?
Yes.
Did you note any signs of injury in this photo?
So there's some ecchymoses around the left eye. This picture, it's a little bit hard to see, but I think there's another one coming up. There's also an area of ecchymoses up here on the left side of the forehead with also some swelling associated with that. The lips have some contusions and small lacerations. And then on the left shoulder here, you can see a little bit of some ecchymoses here. Or again, ecchymoses are kind of like big bruises. So this is his right arm near the elbow. And right here you can see this kind of darker area. So this looks similar to an abrasion, but it's actually, it's what's called drying artifact. And again, this is one of the reasons that I think that he was in that suitcase for a little bit longer. Most likely that was a pressure point where part of that suitcase was resting on his elbow in that area. And then after death, that tissue dries out, and that's the discoloration that you're seeing there. So here you can see a little bit better. I don't know if you can get a feeling for this, but this area is what we call edema or swelling. So this whole area is edema. It's a little bit discolored, so ecchymosis. And then again, really at the corner of the eye here, you can see that darker discoloration. And so those are injuries from blunt force trauma. So this is the left shoulder and arm. So again, you can see this kind of red to purple area. So this is all ecchymosis, and then a couple of linear abrasions or scratches. This is the same area, just a little bit closer up, so you can see this whole area of ecchymosis. It's a little bit variegated, differential in color, but again, that's all blunt force trauma.
And what part of the body is this we're looking at?
This is the left shoulder. That's the same area, but in this picture we have a scale or the ruler.
And why do we use scales or rulers?
That's just to give an idea of how big the area is or how large the injury is.
7 from the composite?
So this is the left forearm and hand, and you can see the area right here, that's a little bit red to purple, and then also right here on the left hand, right here and here. Those are all areas of ecchymosis, again, blunt force trauma. Sure, so you're talking about this area?
Yes.
So that's called livor mortis or lividity, and that's one of the changes that we see, again, after death. And basically what that is it's postmortem, after death, settling of blood in the blood vessels. And so it's dependent on gravity, and it's dependent on the person's position. So what I mean by that is we're seeing it on his back because after the time of death, at some point in time, he was more positioned on his back. And the areas that are lighter, that's because for a couple of reasons. It could be the position of the body, meaning that it's not in the gravity-dependent position, or there could be something pressing on it. So either one of those. These areas are associated with hemorrhage or bleeding into the skeletal muscle, so the deeper tissues. And so that's just indicating more force applied to that area. This is just showing the upper back and the back of the neck. We've got a linear abrasion right here on the back of the neck, and these were the ones shown in the earlier pictures.
You also mentioned impact to the left side of the head,
Yes.
and I believe that was subgaleal?
Subgaleal, so kind of similar to what I was describing on the back. I looked at the underside of the scalp. And so in those areas on the left side of his forehead where there was the edema, when we reflect or we fold the scalp over, there was hemorrhage or bleeding that went through the entire scalp and was deposited on the skull. There was no associated skull fracture, and there was no bleeding inside of the skull, but it was all in the scalp and deposited on the outer surface of the skull.
So under the skin, but not under the skull.
Correct.
Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Any cross-examination?
Yes. Doctor, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is James Owens, and I'm one of the lawyers that represents Sarah Boone here today. And I've got a few questions. Can we first talk about the toxicology?
Yes.
The alcohol. You said you've done approximately 3,000 autopsies. And of those autopsies, how many years would that have been over that period of time?
12 years.
Okay. So when you first got down here from Tampa, I think you were up in the Northeast, came down here to Tampa, that's when you started?
Yes.
And you would agree you've interpreted toxicology results in all or most of those cases?
Most, yes.
And you did order the blood alcohol test of the decedent in this case? And you said he was a .38?
No, 0.138.
0.138. And you also ordered the vitreous level?
Yes.
Of alcohol as well? And the result was a .213?
Yes.
And you would agree that's about 3 times the legal limit?
Close, yes.
Now, you would agree that at those levels, there are some pharmacologic effects from ethanol in the body?
Yes.
And I know you mentioned some, but you agree that level of alcohol in the body would impair somebody's judgment
For most people, yes.
and their decision-making abilities.
Yes.
And it would release inhibitions,
Yes.
and they would be more apt to take risk that they otherwise would not.
Yes.
Can you tell us when Mr. Torres drank the last drink he had prior to getting in the suitcase?
That I can't tell you because, if somebody had been drinking either periodically throughout a time period or continually throughout a time period, that's difficult to say.
So he could have stopped drinking an hour before he got into the suitcase, or 5 minutes before he got into the suitcase, or 4 hours before he got into the suitcase.
Yes.
We just don't know at this
Correct.
point. All right, now I want to talk about time of death determination. It's fair to say that you did not go to the scene that day that Mr. Torres was found.
No, a medical legal death investigator from our office went to the scene.
So there was an investigator with your agency named Ashley Hammermeister
Yes.
that went to the scene,
Yes.
and she would have prepared a report.
Yes.
And you would have reviewed that report.
Yes.
Now, you examined and assessed the body of Mr. Torres at the time of the autopsy,
Yes.
and you said that the body was ambient temperature.
Yes.
Is that the normal air temperature we're in today?
Whichever environment you're in, yes.
So the body was not stored in a cooler for 24 hours?
No, the body was stored in the cooler, but in the mornings when we get there, the bodies are brought out of the cooler.
Okay. How long had the body been out of the cooler before it was examined by you? Do you know?
Most likely an hour to an hour and a half.
Now, considering the 3,000 autopsies, how many cases have you ruled the cause of death as positional or postural asphyxia?
A handful of times. It's not very common.
So about 5 times or less?
Yes.
Now, you said Mr. Torres was 5'2" and 103 pounds?
Yes.
Do you know how big the suitcase was that Mr. Torres was in?
I don't have the exact measurements with me.
So if I told you the measurements, you wouldn't know one way or the other what they were?
No, I think they were described to me, and I saw the pictures from the scene, and I was able to review crime scene photos to see what the actual suitcase was like.
Okay. Do you know the crown to rump length of Mr. Torres?
No,
Did you do any demonstrative study on the suitcase to determine what kind of spacing he would have inside that enclosure?
no,
And you don't know the position that Mr. Torres or his orientation at the time that he was in the suitcase was?
Again, I favor a fetal position, but again, I didn't observe him in the suitcase.
But you don't know exactly what the positional component was that caused, or what led you to believe caused his death?
Correct. I mean, based on his stature and what the suitcase was, he would have had to have flexed at the hips and knees to be able to fit into the suitcase.
So based on what you've said, you would agree you didn't know how much Mr. Torres would have been able to move and stretch his various extremities inside the suitcase, do you?
No,
So you would agree that his repositioning inside the suitcase would have been easier if he didn't have so much alcohol in his bloodstream?
I don't know that I would agree with that.
Excuse me?
I don't know that I would agree with that.
Well, you said his fine motor skills would be impaired by the alcohol.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you meant his ability to just move.
To reposition himself inside this, that would be limited to some degree by the alcohol he consumed.
It could be. I mean, that's not really a fine motor skill. But
Okay. Or the use of his hands to unzip the suitcase would
Sure.
be affected by the alcohol that he had consumed.
Sure, that could be.
Okay. Now, the environmental suffocation deals with the lack of oxygen.
Yes.
Correct? And due to that insufficient oxygen that we breathe in the air, so you essentially run out of the oxygen in the space.
Yes.
So I guess years ago, how this sometimes would occur was a child would somehow get into an old refrigerator and it would be enclosed, so it was airtight, and eventually you would run out of oxygen.
Yes.
You would agree with that?
Yes.
Do you know the volume of room air contained in that suitcase?
No.
Do you know how porous the fabric of that suitcase was?
No.
Did you run any tests on the suitcase?
No.
Were you aware that the suitcase, the lock on it or the zipper on it was broken? The pull handles were broken?
Yes, I did know that.
Do you agree if there is a portion of the zipper that's open, that air can travel in and out of that space?
Yes.
Do you know what the anticipated exchange of gases would be through that fabric?
No.
Do you know if, the suitcase was out in the rain and it rained, do you know whether or not rain or the liquid would pierce the interior?
I don't know.
So from what I gather, no studies were done on the suitcase.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So we don't know, that zipper being busted, what exchange of air could go in and out.
Correct.
I think you said there are physiological effects once the value or percentage of oxygen is decreased from the norm. You
Yes.
said 8 to 10% you become unconscious,
Yes.
and then a value of less than 8% death occurs.
For most people, yes.
Excuse me?
For most people,
And the normal oxygen saturation in adults and children is 95 to 100%.
yes.
So if it decreases, the oxygen decreases less than 10%, someone would lose consciousness and die within less than 30 minutes.
So that's hard to give a time frame on that. Studies that have been done shown that the oxygen, content is anywhere from 4 to 6. Unconsciousness can occur in less than a minute, death within minutes. But those have been empirical studies.
So, and I know that's kind of, maybe you tell me, that's kind of why you gave the two different diagnoses, the environmental and the positional. is because the environmental may have had an effect or the positional may have had an effect, you're not sure, so you listed them both?
It's not that I'm not sure. I think that both mechanisms were at play at the same time, and that's not unusual in deaths, is there can be multiple factors occurring at the same time.
But you don't know the percentages, 50% for one or 70% for one, 30 for the other. You don't know.
No.
But you would agree in concert, if these two causes, the positional as well as the environmental, if they were acting in concert, that would render a relatively short amount of survival time.
I can't say.
You just don't know.
No.
Now, we talked about these blunt force injuries, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Would it be fair to the jury to say that there were no broken bones?
There were no broken bones.
And it would be fair to say that the blunt force injuries on his body that the jury has seen here today did not contribute to the cause of his death.
Not likely.
Now, I want to draw your attention to the cardiovascular system. Do you have your report?
I do.
Okay. You described the proximal third of the left anterior descending coronary artery having greater than a 75% narrowing of the lumen due to its centrically placed firm yellow-white fibrolipid atherosclerotic plaque?
Yes.
And is that pretty much verbatim with what you said in the report?
Yes.
Okay. And that terminology is synonymous with a single vessel high-grade atherosclerotic coronary artery disease.
Yes.
And in that location, it's kind of a classic location for what people refer to as the widowmaker,
Yes.
because of the location in that vessel that supplies most of the circulation to the left ventricle.
Yes.
If you had a spasm in that artery, that could nearly totally obstruct the lumen and cause a fatal heart attack, could it not?
It could. It could cause a dysrhythmia, yes.
I'm sorry?
A dysrhythmia or an abnormal beating of the heart.
But that could kill him.
It could.
If he were to get out of the suitcase on his own, and he would have passed out or fell asleep on the couch, and she would have woken up the next day about that time and came down, and he was dead on the couch, and you did this autopsy, would it be fair to say that in your ruling on cause of death, that single vessel coronary artery osculosclerosis would be your probable cause of death?
It could be, but any sort of injury overrides natural disease if the injury is significant, right? So you don't have to be a perfectly healthy person to have trauma and die. So it's very common that we see people that have injuries for whatever reason, but also have a lot of natural disease. But we look at it as the injuries override the natural disease because especially atherosclerotic disease, that's considered long-term, right? So that's been going on for years and years. People walk around with that all the time. So what's different is that we have trauma, and so that overrides natural disease. And sometimes natural disease can contribute, but again, it depends on the individual, it depends on the circumstances.
Seat and state and spell your name for the record for us.
My name is Meredith McCaskill, and it's spelled MEREDITMCCASKILL.
Thank you. Mr. J, you may inquire.
Thank you. Where do you work, ma'am?
I am employed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Orlando Regional Operations Center.
And is that also called FDLE?
Yes, it is.
And what do you do for FDLE?
I am a senior crime laboratory analyst in the biology DNA section. Yes, it is. All of those samples were represented as being from those particular individuals, so their DNA is expected to be on those items.
Was there any DNA foreign to Ms. Boone on those samples that were representative as coming from her fingernails?
No, there were no DNA results foreign to Ms. Boone obtained from either set of fingernail swabs.